what ended up happening was that a lot of people died, not just from COVID, but from not getting the treatment they need on time, right? And so there was a study that came out that basically showed that thousands of people in Canada died unnecessarily from having delayed care. Completely unrelated to COVID, just they had a treatable disease or problem. And the hospitals were like, we can get to you in 18 months. And the person's like, I need this treatment in 3 months or I'm gonna die. And then 7 months go by and they die. And that got worse during COVID, but that happens every day in Canada.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Undoctrination. I'm Maggie, and this week I have on my friend and colleague, Patrick Carroll, who is the new managing editor at FEE. Congrats on the promotion, Patrick. And while we've known each other for, I think, over a year now, I only recently just met Patrick as he was on a trip throughout the southern United States. Actually, it was more the East Coast. If you guys didn't know, Patrick is from Canada, so we have a wild Canadian on the show this week. And I wanted to bring him on to kind of continue this informal series of interviewing other young libertarians that are from different countries about, kind of the political culture in their countries and also discussing, how different systems work. So we had Jess on for the past 2 weeks. We had a friend of mine from Argentina on a few months ago, and now we have Patrick. Patrick, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. And I did want to hear a little bit of a recap of your trip throughout the States. I know you've visited the FEE office in Atlanta, but you also went and hung out with a bunch of other crazy libertarians throughout the South.
Yeah, it's been an awesome summer. I've been doing a lot of traveling. First, I hit up PorcFest in New Hampshire in June, and then I had a big month-long road trip in July. So I went to a barbershop competition because I sing in a barbershop chorus. So that was in Louisville. And then I went to Freedom Fest in Memphis, where I got to meet a lot of FEE people as well as some other great people there. And then I went to Mises U in Auburn, Alabama for my first Mises U. So it was a really great trip, a lot of fun.
Amazing. And you were telling me you wanted to talk about, what was it, grocery store plastic bags?
Yeah,
that was kind of a wild experience.
For those who don't know, plastic grocery bags were banned in Canada like a year ago. So we used to have them like normal, and now we don't. So when I was in Georgia, I went and did some groceries, and there were some plastic grocery bags there, and I was shocked because I hadn't seen plastic grocery bags in a grocery store in over a year. And
falling to my knees and crying in the grocery store.
Yeah. My takeaway was, do not take your freedoms for granted, my American friends, because it's the little things,
That's so funny. It's the same for me with plastic straws. When I lived in Austin, Texas, I think they had been banned or a bunch of stores had phased them out. And I absolutely despise paper straws. I think they're disgusting. They send chills down my spine when I have to use them. So if there's a paper straw, I'm not using a straw, which I think is the point. But yeah, when I moved back to a free place and there were plastic straws, I feel like I had the same feeling. Like, thank God my freedom is back.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about your trip because I know that you are like the one libertarian in the People's Republic of Canada. It's quite a dire situation up there. So how have the past few years been? Because I know, when the U.S. Was kind of throwing everybody's freedom in the garbage, Canada was like lighting them on fire. So it was kind of 10 times worse up there. So what was that experience like for you throughout COVID?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't fun. The lockdowns lasted something like 2.5 years, depending on where you were. There were vaccine passports in various provinces at different times. Schools, of course, were closed. It was bad. And international travel was significantly restricted. In terms of comparing to the U.S., it really depends, right? Some parts of the US, like certain cities, were super severe. I do think Canada on net was worse than the US in terms of lockdowns and severity, but also like how long they lasted. So yeah, it wasn't fun. It broke up a lot of social circles, right? People became very isolated. I certainly experienced that. I know a lot of my friends did. And of course, we had the Freedom Convoy protest was a big deal around specific vaccine mandates. And so there was kind of a backlash, which was heartening. And I wrote about it at the time for fee.org and talking about this. But, you know, in terms of practicalities, it didn't seem to do much. Maybe maybe the mandates ended a few months earlier than they would have otherwise. But yeah, by and large, Canada became a very authoritarian country over those few years and still is in some ways.
I'm so glad you brought up the Freedom Convoy because I remember scrolling through social media during that time and literally tears coming to my eyes when I saw these truckers protesting en masse. And I think it's like a testament that, America isn't the only place where freedom matters to people, and that if you push people to a certain point, they will start to break and rise up in whatever way possible. I know a lot of that was happening over in Europe, especially with like more climate related lockdowns. But yeah, I mean, why do you think Canada was able to extend those lockdowns out so far? Because in the US, like, I feel like, yes, in certain cities, they were able to carry them out for a long time and put in these, really restrictive vaccine passports. But it seemed like it was so much worse in Canada, and that people just like outside of the trucker convoy just kind of put their hands up and dealt with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a saying in Canadian politics that Canadians tend to defer to authority. And I think that's largely true. If you think about the American spirit, it's a very rebellious, like, you can't tell me what to do, like, you're not the boss of me kind of spirit. Canadians have a little bit of that, but much more it's like, well, the government's taking care of us. They know what's best. We should trust them and follow them. This very communitarian kind of like, let's do what's good for the country. Let's do what's good for the community. And so that's a huge part of why these lockdowns were so popular in the first place and why they lasted as long as they did. And I think that's one of the key differences between Canadian and American political culture is this kind of deference to authority attitude versus, no, my rights are important attitude.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like it goes back all the way to the time of our country's foundings because Americans kind of just raged against the machine over in Great Britain while Canada kind of is still tied to the crown, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you were talking about, and I've heard this about Canada before, that there is this kind of like little brother syndrome when it comes to Canada and the US, and that Canada kind of gets its value from what it's doing that is not what the US is doing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how that relates to maybe some of the rights that Canadians have given up?
Absolutely. So a huge part of Canadian identity is that we're not Americans, we're better than Americans. And so you see this in like our pride in our national healthcare system. It's like, oh, Americans, they have that private healthcare, but us Canadians, we have this great system. But it's really across the board. There's a lot of protectionist policies around Canadian media, right? Because Canadians really value this distinctive identity that's like, we're not going to let American media swamp us. We're not going to let American products swamp us. We're going to be our own unique thing. And you're right that does kind of go back to the founding. And I think it's interesting how that shows up in the policies, right? It's not just this cultural identity, but it's this political identity of we're better than America because we're less free in some ways, right? America's like, we're better because we're free. And Canada's like, we're better because we're not going the privatized, capitalist, greedy way that America's going.
Yeah, so I was interviewing Jess Gill, who's from the UK, and she mentioned that during the BLM riots in America, protests started happening in the UK, like over things that were happening in America. And it does seem like American issues kind of flow outward to the rest of the world. And I've noticed that things that are really big issues in America, I'm not saying that Canada only addresses them because there are issues in America, but things like gun violence. I know that Canada passed during the time of the lockdown some really restrictive gun control. Is that like, are people okay with that in Canada? Is that like something that's constitutionally protected like it is here?
It's not constitutionally protected, and people are not just okay with it; they want it. They're happy about it for the large part. Obviously, there's some detractors, but yeah. So there is now a handgun sale freeze in Canada. So it's basically illegal to buy and sell handguns. There's a lot of other restrictions. There is no constitutionally protected gun rights in Canada, and so that's part of why you see this. But the main reason is Canadians want it. Canadians don't like guns. It's one of the aspects of pride is that we don't have the gun crime that America has, and most Canadians would attribute that to stricter gun laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a fundamental difference of values, I think. Like here in America, we are really concerned with having freedom above pretty much anything. Obviously, we ask the government to step in for us and grant us safety no matter the side effects that happen. But we still retain, freedom as like one of our top political values. And I was talking with Jess about the NHS in England. And when we were talking before this call, you brought up that the healthcare system in Canada is almost like a state religion. It's the same in the UK. But I think that highlights something about human psychology. And that is once you believe you're getting something for free, you'll remain really, really attached to it despite all of the problems. Do you feel like people are really, truly able to criticize the healthcare system in Canada? And in that criticism, are people typically calling for just more funding, or is there any kind of national conversation about just getting rid of it altogether?
Yeah, there's no real national conversation about getting rid of it. By and large, the people who criticize it are saying we need more funding. It's very similar to the UK. Canada and the UK are similar in a lot of ways, and the kind of idolization of this state healthcare system is certainly one of those ways. And I've thought a lot about like why is it that Canadians are so attached to this system? And of course, they would say, well, because it works, right? And you can look at different stats comparing Canada to other countries in the world, and we have better healthcare outcomes on all of these metrics. Now, how much of that is attributable to us just being a rich country versus the nature of the system is, of course, the crux of the debate. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, so I think status quo bias is really big. So status quo bias is this effect in psychology where whatever's the status quo, people are going to lean toward that. People don't like change. And so we almost have this psychological inertia, and I think that's a huge impact. And a good way to expose status quo bias is with something that researchers call the reversal test, which is where you say, okay, if we didn't have this, would you want to implement it, right? So I think it'd be a really interesting experiment. If we didn't have universal healthcare right now, would you advocate to implement it? I'm not sure how many people would say, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way before. So status quo bias, I think, is part of why there's such this idolization of the current healthcare system. I think social proof is another factor. So basically, if everyone around you says, yes, this is a good idea, then you're more inclined to agree, yes, this is a good idea, just because people like to fit in and be part of the group. And so I think those are part of the explanation for why Canadians are so uncritical and just like assuming like, of course our system's better. Of course privatization is the wrong route to go. I don't think a lot of them have really thought through the economics of why that might be a bad idea.
Why would you say it's a bad idea?
Yeah, so I'd say that it's a bad idea for the same reason that having the government run anything is a bad idea. We know that free market competition leads to lower prices and higher quality, right? If we're talking about shoes, if we're talking about haircuts, if we're talking about food, you don't want a monopolist providing your service. You want competition, right? And I see no reason why healthcare should be any different. It's another sector that's subject to the laws of economics, just like any other sector, right? And so I'm not saying that, I want poor people to not get healthcare. What I'm saying is I think a free market system will be better at giving healthcare to everyone, including the poor, because when you have competition, right, when the price mechanism, when the profit and loss mechanism can do their work, you tend to get better outcomes. We see this across sectors. The healthcare sector is the exact same. And so I think that there's a very strong economic case for a free market. And this is the problem, is whenever you say privatizing healthcare in Canada, people are like, oh, it's going to be like the US. And I have to clarify, no. As much as the US is more of a privatized system, it's extremely heavily regulated. Mm-hmm. And right, there's so many laws, occupational licensing, certificate of need laws, right? You look at the FDA and pharmaceuticals. And so what I try to clarify to Canadians is, no, I'm talking about a free market where healthcare providers literally have free reign to offer the services that they think best. And I think that really is the key. But Canadians are just like, oh no, America has private healthcare. Private healthcare sucks because you have to pay for it. And there just isn't this reasoning through the logic.
Yeah, it's so funny you brought up certificate of need, because that is one of my pet peeve issues in the US. It's a problem here in Georgia where I live currently, and it's a really significant problem in Louisiana. So basically, certificate of need, if you want to open up, let's say, a hospital or some type of healthcare service, you aren't just going through a licensing board to prove that you can provide this service and that you have the qualifications necessary. You also have to prove that the area that you're placing your business in actually needs you there. And who is that determined by? Your competition. So there's this woman named Ursula Newell Davis in Louisiana, and she was trying to open up like a social services business, offering her services to disabled children in the New Orleans area. And she had a ton of experience, all of the qualifications necessary, and they denied her certificate of need, basically saying that, the poor children in New Orleans who can't get this care and can't afford it in other places, they don't need her. So it's basically a way to stifle competition. There's a lot of laws on the books that are heavily regulating the healthcare industry in America. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, people tend to look at our system as the privatized system. And I think we're a horrible example, because there's so much overregulation within healthcare here. And that's part of why it's so expensive. Like, hospitals are getting denied in rural areas because there's a hospital an hour away. And it's like, that's not going to help people. But yeah, I was curious how this kind of showed up in COVID, because here in America, a lot of our hospitals were overwhelmed. And some surgeries that were considered elective had to be put on the back burner. But I know if your whole healthcare system is kind of controlled by the government, well, they're the ones dictating who needs what and when they need it. So I know that you wrote an article about people being denied certain life-saving procedures because COVID took priority.
Yeah, so obviously whenever the government runs medical care, they have to make decisions about rationing and stuff like that. And one of the big downsides of a state-run system, where private competition is illegal, by the way, is that you have long waiting lists. And so the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian-based free market think tank, has done a lot of research and publishing reports about the long wait times for healthcare in Canada. It's brutal, right? We're talking well over a year for certain procedures, which is why there's such a big medical tourism industry where Canadians go to other parts of the world so that they can actually get the care they need on time. With COVID, of course, the system, which is usually operating in a state of crisis, was really operating in a state of crisis and overwhelmed. So many quote-unquote elective surgeries were put on hold by the government. The government basically said, we will not let you have this because other things take priority. The hospital system, of course, was definitely stressed. And what ended up happening was that a lot of people died, not just from COVID, but from not getting the treatment they need on time, right? And so there was a study that came out that basically showed that thousands of people in Canada died unnecessarily from having delayed care, completely unrelated to COVID. Just they had a treatable disease or problem, and the hospitals were like, we can get to you in 18 months. And the person's like, I need this treatment in 3 months or I'm going to die. And then 7 months go by and they died. And that got worse during COVID, but that happens every day in Canada. And it saddens me. And I think it's a crime that it's illegal for healthcare providers to even offer private alternatives to the public system to help people like that who are really in need.
Yeah, I read your article on this. It was 4,000 people. And like all of these people these are individual stories. Like, so this isn't just like one story would be terrifying, right? You have a government-run healthcare system and it's your only option, right? Like you have no other options to turn to for healthcare because they decided to completely take over the industry. And you have 3 months to get this surgery and they tell you, sorry, it's going to be 18 months. That's horrifying. Like I genuinely don't know what I would do. And that happened to 4,000 people within the months of August to December 2020. That's such a dystopian
and that's the ugly
nightmare.
side of Canadian healthcare that Canadians don't like to talk about.
Right. And I did want to ask you this because, I believe in choice and everything. And I know that euthanasia is a big topic of conversation, especially in Canada, because Canada, for those who don't know, has legalized euthanasia for a lot of people. I know they recently, they might have put it on hold. So we'll find an article after this and link it. But they were legalizing euthanasia all the way down to 18 and for mental health conditions. So as much as I am pro do what you want, like the government shouldn't be able to tell you what to do, this is one of those situations where the government has legalized assisted suicide and they are running the healthcare system. So they're responsible for the bill for everyone. And there have been multiple stories of people who have severe illnesses who are encouraged by their doctors to pursue the euthanasia route. And I would bet money on it that it's because the Canadian healthcare system wants to save money by going that route. So that is just pure nightmare fuel. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it because I know it is a hard question for libertarians, but this is not, a free market healthcare system. So there are other incentives at play.
Yeah, definitely a lot of perverse incentives. And it's definitely a tricky issue, right? Because as you say, choice is important. And, I don't know if I could look someone in the eye who's suffering and say, no, you have to stay alive, because pain is real and that's a hard decision to make, right? So I do tend to lean toward medical freedom in that area as a general principle. That said, I'm also cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of perverse incentives, right? The memes coming out about you stubbed your toe, we want to try assisted suicide. It's like, yeah, I'm not okay with that, right? We need to be very delicate in how we handle this as a culture, and it seems like Canada has not been doing that. So while I do have a general disposition toward letting people make their own choices, I think, as you say, that would better take place in a context of an actual free market where you don't have all of these perverse incentives going on. So yeah, absolutely. It's a complicated issue. There's no easy answer.
Yeah, that's absolutely wild. And I did kind of want to turn to the subject of Justin Trudeau because he is like the darling of the left wing in the United States. Like everyone on the left here is really jealous, because he's young, he's liberal. How has Canada shifted under his leadership? Because it seems like Canada was a little more left-leaning than the U.S. for a long time, but it's kind of been ramped up under his reign.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's accurate. So Justin Trudeau was first elected as prime minister, I think, in 2015. One of the first things he did was he made his cabinet, which is basically his top officials, a complete gender balance, 50-50, which a lot of people criticized him for because it's like, meritocracy. And then basically throughout his, let's call it a reign, because I think we have rulers more than leaders. Mm-hmm. Throughout his reign, there's been a lot of scandals over like things that you would think would end his prime ministership, and then he gets reelected. And then another scandal comes out, and then he gets reelected. Obviously, he's bad on a lot of issues in terms of gun control. Government spending, of course, went through the roof during COVID. Not that anyone here seems to care, but that was a big deal. LGBTQ, pro-choice. There's a lot of issues where I have disagreements with him, but it seems he keeps getting reelected. And I've been thinking about this because the first time he was reelected after all these scandals, happened, I was like, there's no way he got reelected. And I was thinking about why is that? Like, why does this guy who's not exactly popular keep getting reelected? And I think it has to do with the way the political parties kind of situate themselves in Canada. So in Canada, we have the Conservative Party, which is roughly equivalent to the Republican Party, except all of Canadian politics has shifted left, right? So, and then there's the Liberal Party, which is like the Democrat Party. And then we have the NDP, which stands for the New Democratic Party. They're a little bit further left than the Liberals. And then there's also the People's Party of Canada, which is a little bit further right than the Conservative Party. But basically, the two big parties are the Liberals and the Conservatives. And the Liberals, I think, have just been very good at staying with the median voter. People in Canada really are afraid of the Conservatives. They say, oh, they're just like Trump. They want to cut taxes on the rich. They don't believe in climate change. They're going to go after abortion rights and LGBTQ rights and stuff like that, even though half of that isn't true. There's a saying in politics, you don't vote for someone, you vote against someone. And a lot of Canadians vote against the Conservatives. And so even though the Liberals are a really bad choice, and I think a lot of Canadians would agree that the Liberals are a really bad choice, they say, look, the NDP are basically indistinguishable from the Liberals. And besides, we can't have the Conservatives win. And so everyone just votes for Liberals. And I think that's why Trudeau keeps getting reelected. And the reality is, even though from an American perspective, he's like, really far left in a lot of ways and not respecting rights and all of that, a lot of Canadians do like him. And this is just Canadian political culture is we get the leaders we deserve, right? And in a lot of ways, Trudeau is a good representation of where a lot of Canadians are at.
So he's like a moderate by Canadian standards.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
That's crazy. I do think part of the appeal is his youth. I know that's like a huge part of the appeal for people in America because we have really, really, really old representatives. Although we elected Joe Biden, and I think the same thing happened here. A lot of people could not comprehend why Joe Biden got elected, and it had everything to do with Trump, right? People hated him. So, and people loved him. It's like someone that divisive is going to, elections will kind of swing either way. I know Canada also has some interesting separatist movements. We do kind of in the US, there's the California separatist movement, which is not really by Californians. It's everyone saying we want to shove California off the into an island, turn them into an island and get them away from us. And then, Texas, every once in a while, there's conservatives in Texas saying they want to start their own country. Nothing serious, though. Canada, however, I know there are several there's one big one, but there are several separatist movements, and it makes for an interesting political culture up there.
So the big one is Quebec. So back in the 90s, there were 2 votes on whether Quebec would secede, like referendums. And the first one, the pro-secession vote was something like 30 or 40%, and so it failed. But then the second one was really close. It was like 49.5% in favor of seceding, but it still failed. And there hasn't been a referendum since. But there is still a significant separatist contingent in Quebec. For people who don't know, Quebecois culture is quite different from the rest of Canada. Obviously, they speak a different language, French, whereas most of the rest of Canada speaks English. But also, like, the culture is very different. There's a lot of Catholicism. Obviously, it's more wintry, and so there's a lot of like skiing and snowmobiling. So in terms of the activities they do, in terms of religion, language, there's a lot of ways in which Quebec really is kind of its own little country within Canada. And a lot of Canadian politics revolves around appeasing Quebecers and kind of, playing nice with them so that they don't leave and stuff like that. So there continues to be a significant portion of Quebecers who would like to be their own country. It's obviously a divisive topic, but it hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the past couple of decades just because there hasn't been a vote, there hasn't been enough of a movement. The other one, which is more recent, is Alberta. So Alberta has a lot of oil, and that is a big driver of Canada's economy. But the way that the federal system is set up here in Canada, Alberta kind of gets shafted a lot in terms of its oil money going to other provinces. And there's other ways where Albertans do generally lean more conservative. We like to call it Snow Texas. And so Albertans really feel like they aren't represented by the politicians in Ottawa and would really rather do their own thing. And so there has been in recent years kind of an Alberta separatist movement popping up. It's still nothing major. There's nothing serious being proposed on that front at this point. But it is kind of interesting to see that there's some Albertans who are saying, you know what, maybe we'd be better off without having our lives run by the people in Ottawa, which is a long ways away. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. I know we were having a whole debate as a team maybe a few months ago about the like American divorce or whatever, because that's been a conversation. Divorce. Yeah, a national divorce, because that's been a conversation that keeps coming up as partisanship pushes us apart more and more. I'm kind of just in favor of taking the power at the federal level and just continually distributing it down to more localized forms of government. I assume that's your position as well, although that's a great question. What does your ideal Canada look like? What would you like to happen in Canada if you didn't have to, worry about what people will vote for?
Well, ideally, we secede down to the level of the individual, right? I'm an anarcho-capitalist, and so I think that would be great. But in the meantime, yeah, decentralizing power as much as possible, whether that comes in the form of secession or things like nullification, just generally giving the federal government less power and the provincial governments in Canada, provinces instead of states, not necessarily giving the provincial governments more power, but the more local, the better, I think is definitely a good approach. But just to get people talking about that, like, we need to talk about, why that's important, right? And I think that comes back to educating people about free markets and the freedom philosophy and stuff like that. But yeah, I would love to see a lot of separation, not in terms of like, let's put up a wall and block trade and block immigration. Like, I don't want that. I like the fact that we have this massive free trade and free movement zone. But I don't see why it would be a bad thing to have more localized governance, I think that makes a lot more sense practically. And I think it's a lot more moral than this system where a few people in Ottawa get to decide what everyone in this massive country does.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're in complete agreement. And kind of just one last question before we wrap things up. So what advice would you give as someone who is a libertarian and an anarcho-capitalist, living under a government that, every year is picking away at your rights? What would you give as advice to other people who are kind of living in that situation? How do you take your power back?
Yeah, I think it starts with self-improvement. And I don't just mean like making your bed in the morning, although that's part of it. It's things like reading books, reading lots of good, hard books, like actually giving yourself the education that they don't give you in public school, right? Making sure that you are the kind of person who, when someone else asks you, well, why are free markets better? You actually have a good reason, and you can draw on the history, and you can draw on economic theory, right? Or if someone asks you about gun control, like you've actually done your research. It is so impressive when someone has done their homework and can speak intelligently on an issue. That's a huge part of how we can persuade people, if not to agree with us, then at least to be like, well, this person's thought about it and they're actually pretty reasonable. So knowledge, I think, is huge. And the other one is character. Leonard Reed, the founder of FEE, really stressed the importance of being upstanding people when we're trying to talk to people and have these conversations, right? And so it's so easy to be bitter. It's so easy to be resentful, say, oh, this government, they're constantly, violating our rights, and, I'm just going to go pout, but that doesn't help anything, right? We need to be positive. We need to be models of encouragement and of reason, right? One of the things I love about FEE is that it's a place that I think really values thoughtful, nuanced conversations. And I think the more that we can be leaders and setting an example of having thoughtful, nuanced conversations informed by a wealth of knowledge from all the reading we've done, I think that's going to be the path forward.
Wow. Amen. Mic drop. Absolutely. I think you're right. Personal freedom. There are people living under the most oppressive regimes. I mean, we're kind of spoiled in the West because at least our foundations were built on some semblance of valuing freedom and like rights of the individual. But there are people living under the most extreme tyrannies imaginable, and we can't really imagine what that's like, and they're still fighting for their freedom every day. So the least we can do in the US is do so as well. Is there anything else you would like to add before we sign off?
You can check out my articles at fee.org.
Awesome. And where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at PatrickC1995.
Great. And you can find me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. As usual, hit subscribe, leave us a comment, ask Patrick a question about Canada. And we will see you guys next week. Thanks so much for tuning in.